Good afternoon and welcome to Part 5 of MBA Health Group's webinar mini-series on the Meaningful Use Core Measure Requirements. My name is Cody Simpson and I'm an implementation consultant here at MBA. I know you're busy, so let's go ahead and get started. Today's webinar will focus on measures 10 and 11, Clinical Quality Measures and Clinical Decision Support Rule. There will be time for questions and answers at the end, so feel free to type your question at any time or wait until the end and we will unmute everyone's lines to answer questions. Meaningful use measure number 10 is clinical quality measures. The objective of this measure is to report ambulatory clinical quality measures to CMS. To meet this measure, the provider must successfully report these quality measures selected by CMS in the manner specified by CMS. Core measure number 10 is a yes-no attestation. The provider must attest yes to reporting the CMS ambulatory clinical quality measures, and there are no exclusions for this measure. So let's talk about the specific requirements. Meaningful use stage 1 clinical quality measure requirements. So there are a total of 44 clinical quality measures, of which a provider must report on 6. The 6 reported clinical quality measures are broken down into 3 core or alternate core quality measures, and then an additional 3 of the 38 other quality measures listed. This slide shows the core and alternate core measures. If you have zeros in any of the core measures, you must replace those core measures with alternate core measures, so zeros in the denominator. In the end, the number of alternate core measures reported equals the number of core measures with a 0 in the denominator. So it's important to note that there are no threshold requirements for any of the 44 measures. You don't have to meet a certain threshold, but you will have to report numerators and denominators. We expect to see Stage 2 requirements released in 2014, and while there are no threshold requirements for Stage 1, that's one of the things that's expected to change in Stage 2. Before we move on to the next measure, I want to highlight what your clinical quality measure report will look like if you haven't seen one already. The report contains a list of all your selected clinical quality measures, including numerators, denominators, and exclusions for each measure. This report is generated by the Stimulus Reporting Portal, which is updated each night based on the changes you make in the EHR. It is important to note that the numbering convention on the stimulus report does match the CMS-defined measure number. So in the case of the core and the other core and menu set measures, those report numbers don't match, but here they do. So that's important to keep in mind when you're testing. And the Stimulus Reporting Portal is only accessible once you implement the stimulus set. So if you would like more information about that implementation, please let us know. So moving on to Meaningful Use Core Measure number 11, which is Clinical Decision Support Rule. The objective of this measure is that the provider must implement one clinical decision support rule relevant to specialty or high clinical priority, along with the ability to track compliance with that rule. So let me just point out, along with the ability to track compliance, you don't actually have to track compliance at this point. I know some people get a little worried about that. So there's one definition for this measure, clinical decision support. Clinical decision support is defined as HIT functionality that builds upon the foundation of an EHR to provide clinical staff with general and person-specific information intelligently filtered and organized at appropriate times to enhance health and healthcare. So very broad. The attestation requirement of this measure is a simple yes-no, indicating whether the provider has or has not implemented one clinical decision support rule for the entire length of the reporting period. And here there are not any exclusions. There is, however, one additional requirement for this measure, stating that drug-drug and drug allergy interaction alerts cannot be used to meet this measure. So that's something important to remember. So let's talk about how you can meet this measure. So there's two ways that providers can meet this measure in Enterprise EHR. Number one, by enabling meaningful use alerts or through the use of care guides. So let's talk about enabling meaningful use alerts. At least one meaningful use alert must be enabled for the provider in order for that provider to be able to attest yes to this measure. So each of these alerts is turned on separately, so if you have at least one turned on, then you can attest yes to this measure. It's important to note that this measure is not calculating how the alerts are being used or if they are even being used at all. Stage 1 requirements just require that the alerts be enabled. The second way this measure can be achieved is if a provider has placed any order, including medications, via a care guide. So I'll now quickly demonstrate how you can use care guides to place orders when care guides are available in your system. When you're assessing a problem and placing orders in the ACI, if a care guide for that problem exists, the care guide button will be activated, and you can see that here. When you select the care guide button, this screen pops up, and then you can make the appropriate order selection from the available care guide options. So that's important to keep in mind too. The provider has the autonomy to determine if and how clinical decision support roles fit into the workflow of their organization, whether through care guides or enabling meaningful use alerts. Some of our clients have identified care guides relevant to their practice and used them to meet other measures, such as providing patient-specific education resources, which is menu set measure number 6. So that might be something you want to explore as well. So that's the end. I want to thank you so much for your attendance on today's webinar. Our next webinar will be held on March 1st from 12:10 to 12:20, or you can join us for the same session from 3:10 to 3:20 that afternoon. We'll be covering core measures 12 and 13, electronic copy of health information, and clinical summaries. A recording of today's presentation will be posted to our website that you can see here, and please do not hesitate to contact us with any questions you may have. Since we're just about at 10 minutes, I'd be happy to stay on and answer questions from the audience for the next 5 minutes or so. So please stay on the line if you have questions, and if you need to go, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next week. So I will now unmute everyone's lines to make sure there are no questions. Okay, seeing that there are no questions, I will conclude this webinar. Thank you so much for joining.